Welcome to week 6, where we will be covering chapter 5, which is all about attitudes. Thank you for being patient with the podcast. Again, just having some glitch issues with getting it up and running and showing actually what it was supposed to be showing while I'm talking. So I hope we're all good and that this is coming across well. Let's dive in here. We have the to-do list for this week, and there's a little bit of a change. Please note on the article that you'll be reading. You're going to be reading Article 10, which is called Don't Even Think About It. The syllabus says Article 16. That is an error. So you're going to be reading Article 10. It's down below, so I've attached it here. And it has to do with taboos. So it'll be kind of a fun part of something to look at as we're talking about attitudes. But in terms of the objectives for this week, we're going to be taking a look at why we examine attitudes as social psychologists. Why is it an area of interest? What can it tell us? And then we will dive into the ways in which we acquire attitudes. How do our attitudes develop? And we'll look at many different ways, i.e. through learning. And some of you may be familiar with these principles of operant conditioning, classical conditioning, modeling, and observational learning. The role of social comparison in attitude acquisition. And that kind of piggybacks on what we just finished talking about in the last chapter with the self. We talked a lot about social comparisons in a person's conception of who they are, and it has a lot to say with how we develop our attitudes as well. The reference groups that we use when we're forming attitudes, and how do we take an attitude and change it into a belief that we then retain and hold on to. We'll take a look at the functions that attitudes serve in a greater social context, as well as how they can influence our behavior. So here's where we'll spend a good deal of time when we look at an attitude. How does that translate into behavior? And we're going to see that there can often be a mismatch between how somebody acts and their opinions and the attitudes that they hold. So this issue of pluralistic ignorance will come back up again, as we've talked about earlier in the semester, and how that can influence our behavior and how the concept of it operates in our day-to-day behavior with the ideas that we have, and then what do we actually do about those ideas? How do we see those playing out in our day-to-day? We'll look at some theory behind attitudes that are more planned, attitudes that we actually hold where we've done some research or we've thought about our attitudes to some degree, rather than just being a product of, classical conditioning or operant conditioning. There's times in which we form attitudes and we have opinions because we've given it some thought. So we'll look at specifically theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior, as well as the attitude to behavior process model. And these are just guiding models that we use to understand kind of the stepwise fashion that people take in developing their attitudes. And then we'll sort of transition into looking at persuasion. So sort of the latter part of the book looks at the field of persuasion, because what persuasion is basically getting somebody to do something or getting somebody to think something. We want someone to change their behavior. How do we persuade them? We want somebody to vote a certain way. How do we persuade them? We want somebody to buy a product. How do we persuade them? So it's really looking at the different routes of persuasion, central and peripheral, which sort of maps on a little bit to explicit and implicit in the context that we've talked about that in the past. Just different routes that our brain uses in processing information that's presented to us and how that affects us. And so we'll be looking at elements of reactance, forewarning, and selective avoidance as ways that we can resist persuasion. But a lot of times we're not even aware that we're being persuaded. And there are tactics like fear appeals. How effective are they? I'll let you be the judge when you read the research. And then what does it say for when our behaviors don't fall in line with our attitudes? We believe one thing and we say another. And that's really the field of work called cognitive dissonance. And it's not a pleasant area. Most individuals like to be consistent between what they say and what they do. And so if they're not, or they feel that they're not being consistent, we can have a tendency to ignore the inconsistency. So we'll be looking at that. And that's largely the work of Festinger and Carl Smith. So that pretty much wraps up the chapter on attitudes. And like I've said in the past, really every chapter built upon itself. So I would encourage you all to, as you're reading through the chapter, kind of piggyback and go back to some of what we read in chapters 2 and 3 specifically, where we got into social cognition and social perception, because a lot of those key concepts are going to pop back up here, or you're going to see them talked about in terms of how they affect our attitude acquisition and behaviors. So if you're not, remembering exactly some of that earlier content, it might be nice to even just have like notes next to you that would help guide that a little bit. But here's your attached reading for Article 10. Again, it's looking at taboos and what has been taboo historically versus what hasn't. And it's tied to your discussion for the week, where you're being asked to name 2 current taboos that we have in our society that you do not believe will be taboos 20 years from now. So as you'll read in the textbook, the things that we have attitudes about and beliefs about tend to change with the social currents that we're in, and trends, and all of that can dictate, what's okay, what's not okay, what's approved, what's not approved, what's the norm, what's not the norm. I kind of want you thinking about currently what are 2 taboos, and will they be in 20 years, and what would it take to eliminate each of those as taboos? Like, what would need to happen in society in order for those things not to be taboo? And then the second part of the question is asking you, what personal taboos do you hold? So these might not necessarily be a cultural taboo, but for you, they're taboo. Like, they're things you do not like or you are not for. For example, there might be certain topics or things that you can't discuss, or you choose not to discuss with certain people, yet you do with others. A good example might be, if you come from a family that's a huge Red Sox fans, that it's taboo to even mention the Yankees in your house, or else you'll get crushed. Now, that's a really simple example, but it's really great. I mean, there's certain things that we adapt to, and we know, I can't do this, or I can do this. And it may have to do with the environment or the setting or the people that you're around. And then I want you to discuss what you believe the origins and functions of those personal taboos are on you and the people who are affected by them. And so here's where you really want to integrate not only the Article 10 reading, but also Chapter 5. Here's a good example of how you can cite some of the stuff that you learned up here with how we process information and how it spits out into the attitudes that we hold. How does that come into play when we're talking about something like taboos? How would we see that sort of play out? So use it as an opportunity to really showcase the concepts that you've learned and show me that you're integrating those concepts into your response there. And that's what's going to make for a well thought out response. And I think that is it for this week. Please let me know, of course, if you have any questions as the week goes on. The only videos that you're going to be watching are embedded in the Revel reading, the e-text. So within chapter 5, there's places where there are videos that you can stop and watch, and those are the only ones we have for this week. So a little bit of a lighter week to offset the busier week we had last week. Okay, that's it. But please let me know if you have any questions.